Shomer 9:19 p.m. There are places in history that don't appear on any map. Buildings without names, corridors without records, files that were signed, sealed, and then quietly erased from every archive that was ever supposed to hold them. And inside those places, behind those doors, there were people, real people. With names, with families, with lives they were living before someone decided that their minds, their suffering, could be used for something else. This is not a story about monsters from another world. This is a story about scientists with degrees from respected universities, doctors who took oaths, government officials who wore suits and shook hands and smiled for cameras, people who, by every external measure, appeared completely normal. And yet, what they did in secret, what they authorized, what they funded, what they watched and recorded and filed away, belongs to the darkest chapter of modern science. These are not myths. These are not conspiracy theories. These are documented facts, confirmed by declassified records, congressional hearings, and the testimonies of survivors who spent decades trying to make someone believe them. The files were hidden, but eventually, the truth always surfaces. Let's go back to the years just after the Second World War. The world had just witnessed the most catastrophic conflict in human history. Entire cities reduced to rubble, millions of lives erased. And as the dust settled, as the trials began at Nuremberg, as the world looked at what the Nazi regime had done inside its concentration camps, the medical experiments, the torture disguised as science, the systematic dehumanization of human beings. There was a collective vow. Never again. The Nuremberg Code was written in 1947. 10 principles, a framework designed to ensure that no human being would ever again be subjected to medical experimentation without their full, informed, voluntary consent. It was supposed to be a line drawn permanently in the sand. But here's what most history books don't tell you. At the exact same moment, the world was condemning Nazi doctors for their crimes. The United States government was quietly doing something extraordinary. It was recruiting some of those same scientists, smuggling them out of Germany before they could be prosecuted, giving them new names, new identities, new positions inside American military and intelligence programs. Operation Paperclip. That was the name. Over 700 German scientists were brought into the United States under this program. Many had direct involvement in Nazi atrocities. Several had worked directly in the camps, and yet their files were quietly altered. Their affiliations were scrubbed. Their pasts were because the American government had decided that their knowledge, their terrible, blood-soaked knowledge, was too valuable to waste at the end of a rope. And so the machinery was already in motion. The infrastructure of unethical human experimentation didn't end with the Nazis. In many ways, it simply changed addresses. To understand what came next, you need to understand the climate of the early Cold War. It was a time of profound fear. The Soviet Union had the bomb. Communist ideology was spreading, and American intelligence agencies were genuinely terrified of something they called brainwashing. The term had entered public consciousness through reports from the Korean War. American prisoners of war who seemed to have been psychologically manipulated, turned, made to say and believe things that seemed completely contrary to who they were. Was it real? Could the human mind actually be broken down and rebuilt? Could a person be made to confess to things they didn't do? Could an enemy agent be reprogrammed without their knowledge? The CIA didn't know, and not knowing terrified them. And so, in April of 1953, a man named Allen Dulles, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, authorized a program that would go on to become one of the most disturbing chapters in American history. They called it MKULTRA. The name itself was deliberately obscure, a bureaucratic code to hide in plain sight. MK was the CIA's internal designation for technical services. Ultra was borrowed, some historians believe, from the World War II intelligence operation of the same name. What it actually was a massive, covert program of human experimentation, funded by the CIA, conducted across dozens of institutions. Universities, hospitals, prisons, and private clinics across the United States and Canada, and carried out on thousands of human beings who had no idea what was being done to them. The stated goal was to develop techniques for mind control, to find ways to extract information from unwilling subjects, to create methods for psychological manipulation that could be used against enemies of the United States. The actual methods were something else entirely. The lead scientist who drove much of the early research was a man named Dr. Sidney Go, a chemist with a PhD from Caltech, a man who walked with a clubfoot and cultivated a reputation as something of an eccentric. He kept goats, drank homemade yogurt, practiced folk dancing. By all accounts, he was charming, intellectually brilliant, and deeply committed to what he believed was protecting his country. He was also the man who oversaw some of the most egregious human rights violations ever conducted by a peacetime government. Gottlieb was fascinated by LSD. The drug had been synthesized only a few years earlier by the Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann, and in the early 1950s, it was still poorly understood. Gottlieb believed it might be the key, a chemical that could dissolve the walls of the human mind, make a person malleable, suggestible, open to manipulation. The CIA purchased enormous quantities of LSD from the Swiss pharmaceutical company, and then they began testing it, not on willing volunteers, not on prisoners who had been fully informed of the risks, on ordinary people, on patients in hospitals who had come seeking help for depression or anxiety, on soldiers who were told they were participating in a study about something else entirely, on mental patients who had no capacity to consent, on drug addicts who were given LSD in exchange for a fix of heroin, with no explanation of what else they were receiving. In one operation, a program called Operation Midnight Climax, CIA operatives set up safe houses in San Francisco and New York. They hired prostitutes to lure men off the streets. The men were brought to these apartments, given drinks laced with LSD without their knowledge, and then observed from behind two-way mirrors while their reactions were recorded. The operatives watched. They took notes. They sometimes photographed what they saw, and then the men were sent home with no understanding of what had happened to them, with no follow-up care, with no idea that their minds had been used as a laboratory. But LSD was only one part of the program. MKULTRA had over 150 separately funded research projects. They explored hypnosis. They explored electroconvulsive therapy applied in ways far beyond any medical standard. They explored the use of barbiturates and amphetamines in combination, giving subjects one drug to break them down, then another to stimulate them into a heightened, suggestible state. They explored sensory deprivation. Subjects were placed in isolation tanks, cut off from all light and sound, for periods that exceeded anything previously tested. Some subjects experienced severe psychological disturbances that lasted 4 years. They explored the implantation of false memories, the deliberate creation of multiple personalities within a single individual. An attempt to create, in essence, a human being who could be programmed to carry out a task and then forget that it had ever happened. And they found, in Canada, a partner who was willing to go further than almost anyone else. His name was Dr. Ewen Cameron. Cameron was, by any conventional measure, one of the most distinguished psychiatrists in North America. He was the president of the American Psychiatric Association. He was the president of the World Psychiatric Association. He ran the Allen Memorial Institute at McGill University in Montreal, a respected institution housed in a Victorian mansion on the slopes of Mount Royal. He was also, in secret, receiving funding from the CIA to conduct experiments on his own patients that would later be described by survivors as nothing short of systematic torture. Cameron had a theory he called psychic driving. He believed that the human mind could be wiped clean like a blackboard and then reprogrammed from scratch. He called it depotting. And he was convinced that if he could erase a person's existing patterns of thought and behavior, he could rebuild them into something better, something healthier. What he actually did was destroy people. His patients came to him seeking help. They had depression. They had anxiety. They had ordinary mental health struggles that brought them, trusting, to a doctor they believed had their best interests at heart. What they received was something unimaginable. Cameron used prolonged drug-induced sleep, keeping patients unconscious for weeks at a time. Not days. Weeks. Sometimes months. Patients would be put under using a combination of barbiturates and other sedatives, and left in that state for up to 86 days. While they slept, speakers were placed beneath their pillows. Recordings played on a loop, the same messages, hundreds of thousands of times. delivered into the sleeping mind of a person who had no idea it was happening. Simultaneously, Cameron was applying electroconvulsive therapy at levels that exceeded anything in the medical literature. Standard ECT involved a relatively controlled electrical current administered in clinical conditions. Cameron applied it at 30 to 40 times the normal intensity, multiple times per day, 4 weeks on end. The results were catastrophic. Patients woke, if they woke, with no memory of who they were. They had forgotten how to speak, how to walk. They had lost years, sometimes decades, of their lives. They had forgotten their spouses, their children. They had forgotten how to use a fork. They had regressed, in some cases, to a state of complete One patient, a woman named Linda McDonald, entered the Allen Memorial Institute in 1963 at the age of 26. She had come seeking treatment for depression and anxiety. When she emerged from Cameron's program, she had lost all memory of her life before the treatment. She had forgotten her husband, her children, her entire personal history. She had to learn, again, from nothing, how to read and write. She was not an isolated case. She was one of many, and the United States government knew. The CIA was funding Cameron's work. The money was channeled through a front organization called the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology to conceal the connection. There were CIA officers who visited the Allen Memorial Institute, who reviewed Cameron's progress reports, who continued to authorize payment long after the results were clear. They knew what was happening to these people, and they kept paying. The story of MKULTRA does not end in Canada. Back inside the United States, the experiments continued in prisons. At the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta, at the federal prison in Lexington, Kentucky, inmates were offered reduced sentences or other incentives in exchange for participation in drug studies. They were given LSD, mescaline, heroin, and other substances. They were subjected to hypnosis and psychological manipulation. Some of them were told that what they were volunteering for was a study on the common cold. In one of the more disturbing sub-projects, researchers at Harvard University, among them a young professor named Henry Murray, who would later become a celebrated psychologist, subjected college students to a program of systematic psychological abuse. Students were told they were participating in a discussion group. Instead, they were subjected to hours of intense personal interrogation and humiliation, designed to induce maximum psychological stress. One of Murray's subjects was a 19-year-old mathematics student named Theodore Kaczynski. He participated in the study for 3 years. What he experienced during those sessions, the degree to which his identity and beliefs were systematically attacked and dismantled, is something that later researchers have suggested may have contributed to the profound psychological damage that ultimately led him to become the Unabomber. This connection has never been officially confirmed, but it has never been officially denied. There is another chapter in this story that runs parallel to MKULTRA, one that is, in many ways, even more disturbing, because it targeted people who had even less power, even less voice, even less ability to resist. For 40 years, beginning in 1932, the United States Public Health Service conducted what became known as the Tuskegee syphilis study. The study enrolled 399 black men from McGill County, Alabama, men who were poor, rural, and had little access to medical care. They were told they were receiving treatment for bad blood, a local term used to describe a range of conditions. They were not told that they had syphilis. They were not told that they were a part of a study. And as the years passed, as penicillin emerged as a straightforward cure for the disease they had, they were not given it. Instead, they were studied. Their bodies became data points. Their suffering was documented and published in academic journals. They were given placebos and vitamins and nutritional supplements, all under the pretense of medical care, while the actual infection progressed through their bodies, attacking the nervous system, the heart, the brain. By the time the study was exposed, in 1972, by a public health researcher named Peter Buxton, who leaked the details to the press, 128 of the original participants had died of syphilis or its complications. 40 of their wives had been infected, and 19 of their children had been born with congenital syphilis, a disease that was entirely preventable, that had a cure, that could have been stopped at any point in those 40 years. It was not stopped, because the study needed data. When the story became public, the government's initial response was not remorse, it was damage control. President Nixon's health officials defended the study as having had scientific merit. It was only after a public outcry of extraordinary intensity, only after congressional hearings and the testimony of survivors, that the government was finally forced to confront what had been done. In 1997, President Bill Clinton offered a formal presidential apology. The 8 remaining survivors attended the ceremony at the White House. They were elderly men. They had lived their entire adult lives carrying the weight of what had been done to them in the name of science. And they sat in the East Room and listened to the President of the United States say that what happened to them was wrong. It was a meaningful gesture, and it was 25 years too late. It is important, in telling these stories, not to allow them to collapse into abstraction, not to allow the scale of the wrongdoing to become a kind of shield against actually feeling what it meant to specific human beings. So think, for a moment, about a man named James. James was a participant in the Tuskegee study. He was enrolled when he was in his 20s. He was told by doctors he trusted, because why wouldn't he trust a doctor, that he was being cared for, that his condition was being monitored, that he was receiving treatment. He went about his life. He worked. He had a family. He went back, year after year, because that was what the doctors told him to do. Because the doctors always gave him something, vitamins, aspirin, something that felt like medicine. Because he trusted the people in the white coats. He didn't know that what they were recording was the progress of his disease. He didn't know that the disease was killing him slowly. He didn't know that there was a drug that could have saved him, that had been available for years, and that he was being deliberately kept from receiving it. He died, as many of them did. As the study had always anticipated they would, his death was data. There is one more story that needs to be told. One that takes place not in a lab or a prison or a hospital, but in a children's home. In the 1950s and 1960s, researchers at Willowbrook State School on Staten Island, New York facility for children with intellectual disabilities, conducted a series of studies on hepatitis. To accelerate their research, they deliberately infected newly admitted children with the hepatitis virus. The children who were infected were given hepatitis-contaminated feces, sometimes mixed into milkshakes or other foods. Their subsequent illness was then studied and documented. The researchers argued that since the virus was endemic in the institution anyway, since virtually every child eventually contracted hepatitis, deliberately infecting them upon admission was not materially harmful. The parents of some children were told, when they sought admission to the school, that the only available spots were in the research unit. The implication was clear. If you want your child admitted, you need to consent to their participation in the study. What kind of consent is that? The researchers defended their work. They published papers. They received funding. And the children with no ability to advocate for themselves, children whose parents often had no other options, were used. In 1973, a journalist began digging, and then congressional investigators. And then the documents started to surface. The CIA had maintained extensive records of MKULTRA. Files, memos, financial records, a paper trail that, if it had remained intact, would have provided a comprehensive map of every experiment that had been conducted, every institution involved, every person who had been used. In January of 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of all MKULTRA files. The shredding went on for days. Thousands of documents were destroyed, but Helms made a mistake. Some of the financial records, the boring, administrative paperwork of the program, had been stored in a different location, a CIA records facility that was not part of the main destruction order. In 1977, when a FOIA request uncovered these documents, the true scope of the program began to emerge. Senate hearings followed. The Church Committee, testimony from Sidney Gottlieb, who appeared before Congress wearing dark glasses and speaking in elliptical, careful language that acknowledged almost nothing. What the hearings revealed was enough to confirm what many survivors had been saying for years. Enough to establish that the United States government had conducted systematic, covert, non-consensual human experimentation on its own citizens for over 2 decades. There were no criminal prosecutions. The statute of limitations had passed on most of the crimes. Gottlieb retired to a Virginia farm. He tended his garden. He practiced folk dancing. He died in 1999. He was never charged with any crime. What do we do with all of this? How do we hold in our minds the reality that the same civilization that produced the Nuremberg Code, the document that was supposed to ensure forever that human beings would never again be treated as raw material for scientific ambition, also produced MKULTRA and Tuskegee and Willowbrook and Operation Midnight Climax and Operation Paperclip? There is a temptation to reach for easy explanations, to say that these were different times, that moral standards were different, that people didn't know better. But that explanation doesn't survive contact with the evidence. The people who ran these programs knew they were wrong. That's why they hid them. That's why the files were destroyed. That's why the funding was routed through front organizations and the participants were deceived about what was being done to them. You don't go to those lengths to conceal something you believe is ethical. They knew. They chose to continue anyway. The Nuremberg Code was written in 1947. Tuskegee began in 1932, but it was still running in 1947. It kept running for another 25 years. The men who ran it read the Nuremberg proceedings. They knew the principle of informed consent had been enshrined into international law. They continued anyway. Sidney Gottlieb knew about the Nuremberg Code. He had colleagues who cited it in discussions about the ethical boundaries of research. He ran MKULTRA. Anyway, these were not people who lacked moral frameworks. They were people who decided, consciously and deliberately, that, in their particular case, the rules did not apply, that their cause was important enough, that the people they were experimenting on mattered less than the knowledge they were trying to gain. That calculation, that some people matter less, is where atrocities begin. Always, it doesn't require monsters. It requires ordinary people who have convinced themselves that the end justifies the means, that the subjects of their experiments are acceptable losses in a larger cause. And once that door is open, it is very difficult to close. There is a woman named Velma Howard. She was one of the Tuskegee survivors' family members who testified before Congress. She was composed and clear and devastating. She said something that has stayed with everyone who heard it. She said, "They used us because they thought we wouldn't find out. And when we found out, they thought we wouldn't be believed. And when we were believed, they thought it wouldn't matter." She paused. It matters. The files that were destroyed in 1973, the ones Richard Helms ordered shredded, those files are gone. What was in them, fully and completely, we will never know. There are names we don't have, experiments we haven't documented, survivors who have died without ever knowing what was done to them. That is the nature of a secret that has been partially kept. What surfaces is disturbing enough. What remains submerged, we can only guess at, and that is perhaps the most unsettling thing of all. Not just what we know, but the certainty that what we know is not everything. History has a pattern. The things that are done in darkness, that are hidden and buried and sealed away, they have a way of surfacing, slowly, imperfectly, incompletely. But they surface. A document survives a shredding order. A whistleblower finds a conscience. A journalist follows a thread that everyone else ignored. A survivor finally finds someone willing to listen, and the buried truth rises. Tonight, somewhere in an archive, there are files that haven't been opened in decades. Documents that were classified and have never been declassified. Records of programs that were authorized and conducted and concealed and have never been publicly acknowledged. We don't know what they say, but we know they exist. Because this is how it works. Because this is how it has always worked. The science that goes too far doesn't announce itself. It doesn't publish press releases. It doesn't ask for your permission or your understanding. It simply happens, behind closed doors. In buildings without names, on people who trusted the wrong authority at the wrong moment. And somewhere, in a filing cabinet or a server or a room that most people will never enter, the record of what was done waits. Waits to be found. Waits to be read. Waits to be reckoned with. Because the truth doesn't care how long it takes. It always comes out.